Hi, welcome to On Becoming a Healer podcast. I'm Stefan Kertes here with Saul Wiener and a guest who I will introduce shortly. On Becoming a Healer is a podcast where we talk about issues that are key to forming healing relationships in our care of patients. And this week we're going to be talking about aspects of how we communicate among each other as professionals regarding patient care, particularly when someone we are training in medicine is involved. And for that purpose, we have a special guest, Assistant Professor of Clinical Medicine, Anna Maria Grambelsbacher at University of Illinois at Chicago. We're going to be talking about a story from your background. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Hi, Saul.
Hi, Stefan. Hi, Anna.
So we're going to be talking about a story which goes back to training days for you. And as in keeping with the custom we learned from our colleagues at Curbsiders, we're going to be referring to that hospital as Kashlak Memorial. And I think it'd just be great if you'd tell us the story first, and it'll become obvious what the tensions are.
Yeah. This was from when I was a senior resident, and I was on the general medicine service. I got called to admit an older woman for an in-hospital colonoscopy prep around 11 a.m. And I can't remember who called me with the admission information, but likely it was the GI fellow saying something like, a colonoscopy tomorrow, prep tonight, with not much additional information. In this case, the patient was over 80 years old. She lived alone and she was on Coumadin. So she needed assistance with the bowel prep prior to the colonoscopy and with anticoagulation management. Upon admitting her, she noted she was hungry for lunch, so I put in a diet order for lunch and then made her NPO after dinner.
And then what happened?
Later in the afternoon, I staffed the patient with the general medicine attending who agreed with my plan and management. A little while later, the interventional GI attending paged me, the one who was going to be performing this patient's procedure the next day. When I answered the page, he immediately started yelling at me for allowing the patient to eat lunch.
Really?
I tried to explain that my understanding was she needed to be NPO after dinner, but he yelled over me, he didn't allow me to talk, and screamed something like, "You messed everything up, the procedure's off," and then hung up on me.
Wow.
I then had to go tell the patient she couldn't have her C-scope the next day. She was obviously upset about. It had been a big ordeal for her to come to the hospital and go through this whole thing in the first place.
Oh, what happened next after that?
After talking with her for a long time, it seemed as though perhaps this procedure may have even been unnecessary given her overall goals of care. I ended up sending her outpatient PCP a long note about this botched admission and canceled C-scope, and I updated her PCP about my conversation with the patient regarding her goals of care. I was upset about the whole situation. I felt used and abused by the GI team. I felt terrible for the patient. I felt insulted by the attending who yelled at me and hung up on me. So when I wrote my discharge summary, I included a sentence that said something like, "Unfortunately, the GI team didn't clearly communicate the instructions for prep on admission, and the patient was given lunch. The procedure was then canceled." In my end of rotation feedback later that week with the general medicine attending, he noticed that my discharge summary was unprofessional and I needed to be respectful of consult teams. I apologized for the unprofessional discharge summary and explained to him that I was upset about what had happened and how I was treated. He simply said, "Yeah, that attending is not nice." And that was it. And then the next admission showed up.
So the summary we have is an older woman comes into the hospital because she has to be prepared for colonoscopy, given her age, her frailty, her conditions. She's allowed to eat lunch because the procedure is the next day. And for most of us in medicine, people are asked to not eat after dinner or to skip dinner that day. It sounds like allowing her to eat lunch created an extremely upset gastroenterology specialist who laid that out on you. Do I have it right so far?
That's correct.
And their anger at you was pretty harsh because it involved hanging up on you at the end. And if I hear you right, it felt pretty awful. Is that fair to say?
I was a third-year resident at the time, and I'd certainly had my fair share of unpleasant conversations with people over the course of my time as a resident. But I had never been hung up on or yelled at. And I felt horrible for the patient. I mean, I felt like I had completely messed everything up for her, and this was a big deal for her.
And then, if I understand, you told your attending at the time, and they kind of accepted it? Like, your attending physician, I mean, I'm curious, did you say, "Hey, I was hung up on after being shouted at"?
Yeah. When I initially staffed the patient, I said, this is a direct admission for a C-scope prep. I put in the orders. She'll, liquid diet and NPO after midnight. I let the GI team know that she's here. But then I had to go back to him and say, actually, I'm going to be discharging this patient tonight. And so I had to explain to him why.
I am wondering if that moment was one where you communicated just how brutal the GI attending was. Is there a code not to reference the moments when our colleagues treat us badly when we're trainees?
I can't remember now that we're thinking more about that.
I guess I'm curious what your appraisal of the code is.
There is a code. You're not supposed to, say like, yes, this got messed up and it was this person's fault. Like it's kind of just, especially as a resident, it's your responsibility, especially as a senior resident.
Before we started recording just now, I kind of Googled the question of how long should you be NPO before you have a colonoscopy? And actually, I have to admit, and I should know better because I'm an internist, that I didn't realize that you really are not supposed to eat anything other than liquids for a full 24 hours before you have a colonoscopy. And that is the standard of care. The guideline actually is that you're not supposed to eat anything after breakfast the day before your colonoscopy. Anna giving this woman lunch was inappropriate. Now, you did run it by your general medicine attending, who also approved it, and so it may be that both of you were doing something that was outside the standard of care. And if that's the case, you could argue that the gastroenterologist was correct in being upset in the sense that he shouldn't have to tell a general medicine attending and a third-year resident that the standard of care when someone's admitted for a colonoscopy is that they shouldn't be served lunch. Now, again, I have to confess that if I had been that general medicine attending, I probably would have screwed up as well because honestly, I didn't know that. I am curious if either of you are aware of that as of now.
I'm not. I may have given her clear liquid. I may have ordered like soup or some kind of clear liquid for lunch. I can't remember.
Clear liquid would have been fine, actually.
Whatever diet order I put in and she ended up eating was wrong.
So I think if we give the gastroenterologist the benefit of the doubt, let's assume that you did something that was outside the standard of care. Let's suppose you ordered a regular meal. And you did it, by the way, with the consent of and support of your general medicine attending. So you guys were both wrong, followed by the gastroenterologist just exploding at you on the phone, basically behaving in a way that I think all of us would agree was unprofessional, and then hanging up on you. And then, of course, you reacted to that in a way that was also perhaps maybe unprofessional is too strong a word, but you basically documented in the chart that they failed to communicate with you adequately. And I think, it's possible that was not true, that they should not have needed to tell you that, and that essentially, you were just kind of venting in a way that was inappropriate at that time.
To be fair, there are a lot of things we're all supposed to know, which we don't remember exactly. And, there is a rule for double checking that we all have shared understandings in healthcare. And one can really argue that if one is going to the trouble of having someone admitted to the hospital for a colonoscopy, there is a mutual responsibility that applies in assuring that we have shared understandings of what we're going to do next. And there are many times in life where I have been frustrated that other people around me didn't do what I thought was obvious. And oftentimes I've been in a position of some influence and stopped and thought, if I don't like what they did, maybe I didn't communicate what I thought was supposed to be done. And that's usually true.
Yeah. So I think we can work our way through this case with sort of these agreed facts. And sort of start at the beginning. I think the fact that 3 board certified internists, which we are, we're not aware of the specifics about when you become NPO before you have a colonoscopy. I think it's reasonable to say that the gastroenterologist should have ideally have communicated that at the time. But whatever, that didn't happen. And we can also say that ideally, you and the attending should have known what the guidelines are, even though you weren't told. So both of those things are true. And then I think where it gets really interesting, and I think while we're having this podcast episode, is where the gastroenterology attending calls and behaves in a way that was abusive. And then I think the interesting thing about this episode, this narrative, is that you then do something that was also at worst unprofessional, maybe less, but maybe unprofessional. And yet there are no consequences for the attending's behavior.
Yes.
And in your case, you get sort of gently chided, I think. Is that what happened by the gen med attending?
Yeah, I mean, this is not something that showed up in my written evaluation, but it was something that was end of rotation feedback. Let me give you some advice. This is something you should work on, and don't do this again.
And what happened is the general medicine attending who was supervising you, did not stand up for you with respect to the GI attending. Also, they were complicit in the error that you made, I think, which is important. And then I think we were earlier having a conversation about whether you had adequately communicated to your attending the degree to which you were treated abusively. It sounds like you did relate that information.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure, at least at the time when he commented on my unprofessional discharge summary, I think I explained at that point that I had been very rudely treated and hung up on by this attending.
When I start attending, one of the things I usually say to my team is it's really important to me that everybody here is able to work effectively and gain whatever enjoyment we can gain from this work, even though it's tough. And this means to me that I really want to know and be aware and support you in case you're subject to any kind of mistreatment, whether it's based on race or sex or anything else at all, whether it's from our fellow professionals or professionals in another discipline. Like, that's part of how I need to support you, is to know about that so that we can both protect you and head off problems that might occur in patient care. And I just want you to be aware that I care about that. Mm-hmm. So yeah. I say that. I don't know that I've actually had anybody come back to me and ever say, I was just mistreated. But I do say it, that we're here to know about and to intervene or to be aware of any situation where they're mistreated. Don't we need to declare that?
Yeah.
And to be fair to this situation, we still are not 100% sure how much of the abusive nature of that interaction between you and the GI doctor was fully understood by your general medicine attending.
Yeah. I don't know how much of the story I really let on. I think I'm not sure.
I'm turning this around and suggesting that when one is supervising, I could argue that if there is a hint of a problem that my learner experiences, the next best thing to do is to say, hey, tell me more about what happened with that case for you. And is there, what should I know about that story? Rather than the judgment, like before saying, hey, that was unprofessional, like the first thing we could do is just say, tell me more.
I'm trying to filter all this through the lens of how does this affect the patient's care? Because I think that ultimately that's the most compelling reason to talk about these issues. Of course, I think that abuse of colleagues, abuse of students, abuse of all of that is inherently important. But I think the case becomes even stronger when you look at it in terms of its implications for the patient, particularly when you're trying to make the case for physicians to change their behavior. Because, for instance, it used to be that surgeons would justify, screaming at their subordinates on the grounds that I'm just doing what's right for patients. And then there were some studies that came out that were really significant that actually showed that when there's an environment of fear and intimidation in the operating room, it actually leads to worse outcomes. And that was actually very critical because it really kind of took the wind out of the justification of abusive surgeons. All of a sudden, they could no longer argue that, they're just, defending patients, when in fact it became clear that they were actually a safety threat. And so similarly, I kind of want to explore what happened to Anna in this case through the lens of quality of care, just sort of setting aside the question of, did it make this resident feel bad? And I think that there are issues here. So first of all, one of the things I'd like you to talk a little bit more about, Anna, is you had some concerns about whether this woman should have ever had this colonoscopy in the first place. I mean, she was well into her 80s, and she was quite frail. And so there were real questions. And I know that if you want to talk a little bit more about what you learned when you went to talk with her about the procedure.
From what I remember was that she was on Coumadin. She had some valvular issues. I think she had some chronic iron deficiency anemia of some kind that they couldn't quite figure out. And so probably a GI source. I don't think anyone thought she had a malignancy. I think the idea was that she may have some AVMs, maybe something that could be fixed with the procedure. I don't know how much the chronic anemia was affecting her daily life. I remember her being quite frail, older. I know that she lived alone, and it was a lot for her to come to the hospital. She didn't really want to be there. She didn't really want to have this procedure done. She felt like, she needed to, and maybe she was just in a bad mood that day and she was feeling really down. And maybe 2 weeks before that, she had been telling her primary care doctor, like, I'm short of breath all the time and I don't want to be anymore. And please fix this anemia, find out where it's coming from. I want to be able to walk around. I don't know. I just know what the patient told me that day.
So I think that, there are 3 dots I'd like to connect here, and I'm making some assumptions, and I think you've qualified them already. What I found is that when you have somebody like an attending who calls people, screams at them on the phone, and hangs up on them, it's not occurring in isolation. There are other things that are part of that person's communication style. So I don't think that's separable from the fact that he never communicated in the first place with the team about what the admitting orders were going to be. And then I think also that in turn may be connected to questions about why is a woman who's frail and in her 80s admitted to the hospital for a colonoscopy for somewhat vague reasons. Now, it's possible that it was justified. I think you're being generous here, and it's perfectly possible that it was appropriate. But there were a lot of red flags here. First of all, we try not to do colonoscopies on frail people in their 80s unless there's a darn good reason for it. And for all the reasons you mentioned, she's miserable being there. She can't eat anything. She lives alone. There's so many reasons why this procedure could be a pretty bad thing for her. And so I think the question of whether the goals of care were addressed is an important one. And so I think it's just, we're getting a picture of an attending who doesn't communicate well. We know that in the way he treated you. We know that in the way that the Gen Med attending said he's not nice, he does this a lot. Anyhow, those are some general thoughts that come to mind just listening to this story and trying to put the pieces together.
What do we do when there's someone who's a live wire that everyone has already accepted is kind of abusive in a healthcare environment?
And again, Stefan, this kind of gets at the hierarchy of things, right? Like, who can actually go talk to someone about their behavior? As a resident, I don't think I could have ever gone and knocked on this GI interventional attending's door and said, hi, you made me feel bad when you hung up on me. That just was never going to happen. As an attending, I think I very well could have sent him an email. And I think hopefully I would like to think I would be the kind of person that if something happened to my resident, I would talk to the attending and say, this is not appropriate. Also, the patient care issue. This is not only causing problems for our residents, but it's causing problems for patient care.
I was a program director for 11 years, a residency program director. And so one of the things I made clear when I was a program director is that attendings should notify me if they have concerns that a resident was mistreated by another attending and that I would deal with it. And so I didn't want the attendings on service to feel like they had to handle it. And as a program director, I had a certain legitimacy in contacting any attending if I had concerns about the way they had treated a resident. And now I can also, what I want to clarify here is that if you're an attending on service and you feel like there's a situation where one of your residents has been mistreated by another attending, you don't necessarily have to deal with it yourself. You can, in fact, it may be better if you simply notify the program director, because that is the responsibility of the program director. And the program director has a certain cachet because they are actually responsible for the well-being of their residents. So I found that when I contacted an attending as a program director, they were not defensive because they understood that that was my role to do that. I'll also say that over 11 years of doing this, I had many instances in which a complaint was made about one of my residents. And I found that when I looked into it, I found that about 40% of the time it was the resident's fault, and about 60% of the time it was the attending's fault.
That doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, so I found that on average, residents were better behaved than attendings, not surprisingly. And so, but it was always the resident who was blamed initially. But when I looked into it, I found that it was more often the attending than the resident.
Well, and I think too, to your point from the beginning, I did mess up. If my job as a resident was to admit a patient for colonoscopy prep, I didn't follow the standard of care and I did mess up. At the same time, I was a trainee and I was there to learn. And I had an attending that was there to sign off on my orders. And that's why we staff with our attendings.
I think the most important word you just mentioned was trainee. You were a trainee. And if the gastroenterologist was upset about the way the service has handled the patient, the person to raise that concern with would have been your attending, not you. And so I think the issue here was the fact that the gastroenterologist not only yelled at you, but raised this concern with you at all. I mean, I think they could have said in a very gentle way, look, I have some concerns about the way this was handled. I'm going to give your attending a call. And then they would have called your attending. Yeah, and I think the other point that is worth mentioning here is that all of these communications should occur either face-to-face or over the phone, but never in email or through the chart. So I would argue that, you're putting something like that in the chart does not serve the patient. And again, to get back to the issue that we don't have time to discuss in full depth, which is what should go in the chart. And I think the chart is solely for the purpose of serving the patient's needs. So I think that if physicians and attendings start putting into the chart their discontent with their peers, I think that it doesn't serve the patient. So I would argue that for that reason, it shouldn't go in the chart. But I think that there are a number of lessons here. I've been sort of making a list of them. But before we go through the lessons, I think there are lessons all around Block for what the Gen Med attending should do, for how people should communicate, for what the GI attending should have done, for what you should have done when you were a resident. I think there's so many lessons here. It's a wonderful case. But before we summarize them, let me just ask, Stefan, did you want to say something?
I appreciate greatly the filter that you put on this, which is what is specifically the effect on the patient in terms of how we both handle the chart, and what is the effect on the patient in terms of how we establish patterns of communication amongst each other. It is easy if one is being mistreated or shouted at to think purely in terms of my own experience, what's happening to me. But it's actually very valid to ask, well, what does it mean to have a place like this in which this happens for our patients? That's a perfect framing, and I'd love to hear more.
We can say that the behavior of the specialist undermined an environment in which communication can occur, education can occur, and ultimately that undermines patient care and patient outcomes. And I believe there's data to support that, certainly in the operating suite. And I think that the take-home messages here are sort of as follows. Number one, obviously, as general medicine internists, we always do our best to stay on top of the latest recommendations. And when we're admitting a patient, we should make sure that we're following the best practice guidelines. But there will be mistakes. There will be situations where we overlook that. And that this is probably one of them. Second, if you're a specialist, you should nevertheless communicate what you need, and not assume that a general internist who has to be a jack of all trades will always know what it is that you need. Number three, that when things don't work out, you need to communicate with the general medicine attending, not with the resident, about any concerns you have. Remember, the resident is a trainee. You can certainly share with them that you don't think things went as they should have, but ultimately the communication and certainly any anger or discontent needs to be conveyed to the attending, not to the resident. And then if you're the attending in that situation, I think, a lesson I think for all of us who are general medicine physicians and who have or will do inpatient work is that we need to make it clear to our residents and our medical students that if they become the target of an assault by another attending, they need to tell us, and that if we have concerns about a peer attending when something like this happens, we don't have to deal with it ourselves. We can reach out to the program director, who's ultimately responsible for the well-being of the trainee. By the way, I think we can reach out to the attending if we have concerns about patient care. So those are some of the take-home points for me, certainly from listening to this case. I'm wondering if you all agree with those, if there's anything you'd add, or if you would see things differently.
I certainly appreciate that point, Saul. I think that to remind people what happens for the patient is the crucial element that can guide our thinking.
Yeah, and I think what makes healthcare a little different from many other fields is that when there is abuse and dysfunction in other professions, you don't have patients to harm. right? And I think what's unique about healthcare is that when we have a dysfunctional environment, when attendings are yelling at residents, when residents are feeling traumatized and maybe putting snarky things in the medical record, when attendings are not backing them up, all of these things happen. Ultimately, it's patients who suffer. Ultimately, you end up with a system where you don't have good healthcare communication, where you don't have people working together, where you don't have people learning together, where you don't have problems getting fixed efficiently, where you have people feeling defensive rather than open to growing and changing. And all of that ultimately results in medical error. And there's an enormous amount of evidence to show that. And I think that's why conversations like this are particularly important in the healthcare field.
No, I think this has been extremely helpful, particularly in regard to considering that intersection between patient care, how we treat each other, and how we communicate with each other about what we intend. For me, I'm very thankful to both of you for the time we've given to discuss this case, to your expertise and to your experience. Both of you, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. It was, it definitely gives me more to think about. Something I haven't thought about in 6 years, I think, since it happened. And now all of a sudden, all I can think about is professionalism and communication, how we treat each other. But I think examining these situations definitely makes me a better physician going forward. As attending, it's really important for me to think about these things that happened to me as that while I was a resident, so that I can kind of do better for residents going forward.
We hope you've enjoyed this latest episode of On Becoming a Healer. If you have, and you haven't already subscribed, please consider doing so now. Take care, everyone.